So let me just begin by saying thanks very much for coming. Good afternoon to everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Manuel Barcia, who comes to us from the University of Leeds. Professor Barcia was trained in Cuba and in England. In Cuba, he attended the University of Havana, and afterwards he went to England, where he was a PhD student and eventually receiving his doctoral degree at the University of Texas. Professor Barcia is one of the most renowned specialists in the history of Atlantic slavery. He has published widely in many high-profile journals, academic journals. He is the author of 3 books, and the first one is entitled Seeds of Insurrection, Domination, and Slave Resistance on Cuban Plantations. That one came out in 2008. And he is also the author of The Great African Slave Revolt of 1825, Cuba and the Fight for Freedom in Matanzas. He is more recently has published West African Warfare in Bahia and Cuba, Soldiers and Slaves in the Atlantic World, 1807, 1844. Professor Barcia has carried out research in many places throughout the Atlantic. He has been to archives in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, in Salvador. He has been to archives in Angola as well. He has been to archives, needless to say, in England and in France. Professor Barcia is now involved developing 2 major book projects, at least. One dealing with the history of baseball in Cuba, and the second one, which he has just signed the contract with Yale University Press, deals with the issue of medicine and medical knowledge in the context of the transatlantic slave trade. This is a project that's going to take him back again to Brazil and eventually to Mozambique. This is a very brief introduction that does not do justice to all the accomplishments of our speaker today. Please welcome Professor Manuel Barcia.
Okay, thank you very much. I brought some flyers with discounts for the book. There are only a few, but you can actually photocopy them, and I see they are good.
And I'm going to leave them here, okay?
Don't kill each other, okay? Okay, thank you very much, Roque, for the introduction and for inviting me here as well. At the beginning, actually, I was not planning to come to Brown, but it was Roque who actually proposed that I come, and I was around anyway. So I'm going to try to talk about this book as fast as I can. That doesn't mean that it's going to be fast at all, but I do my best not to take most of your afternoon or early evening talking about that. The reason I wrote this book, it was basically the result of many years of research. The interesting thing, I was talking with a colleague the other day about this, is that the more research you do, the more you accumulate knowledge and information from the sources, the easier later on is to be able to write, because you have all this information accumulated, and this is kind of a clear case of that. I started studying slave rebellions and slave resistance in general in Cuba, and eventually this quest to understand the slave rebellion became sort of a transatlantic enterprise that also incorporated Brazil and Africa eventually. One thing that always troubled me all the time that I was researching this topic is that, or it still is, that most of the focus, when we talk about the Age of Revolution, we talk about this period in the late 18th century, early 19th century, more often than not, we actually think or we conceptualize the age of revolution and we define it by events, processes, historical processes, and historical figures, all of which were from or generated in Europe and the Americas. And funny enough, we don't talk a lot about Africa when it comes to the age of revolution, and it's a really noticeable absence in this field, and it's one that is hindering our understanding and knowledge of what was happening in the Atlantic War at the time. If you think about it, places like Cuba and Brazil, for instance, there are areas in both territories in which 90% of the population at the time is African-born, African race, and yet somehow we have been getting away with writing the history of Atlantic War during the Age of Revolution. We are incorporating Africa as much as it should. So this is kind of a personal reason that informed my decision of taking on the African side of the story. And probably should warn you from now, what I'm working with is this is not a political book. This is not an economic book. This is a book that focuses on the human experience. I'm interested in what happened to people. I'm interested in people, how they thought, how they acted, how they reacted. So basically, the book as such starts in Africa, moves to the Atlantic War, and then it moves to the Americas. And it's kind of a decision that I did consciously. And obviously, it's a book that is about warfare. That for me was the most conducive subject to try to illuminate the things that I was saying. And the reason I said so is because what we call slave rebellions, and at some point in this talk I will stop talking about slave rebellions. You will notice that, just warning you. But for now I'm going to keep it. These slave rebellions, they were extraordinary events. And extraordinary events generate a lot of information. Authorities would take notice of them. They would write down. And I was commenting to Roque earlier today that the Spanish were compulsive bureaucrats. And they would write down everything, which is very convenient for us today. And the Portuguese were not that far behind. So this is something very important for me. Unfortunately, until today, we have a serious issue when we try to understand these slave rebellions. And the problem we have is that there are very few case studies of slave rebellions in the Age of Revolution. Okay? For the case of Cuba, there are movements that have been studied, like the Aponte Conspiracy and Revolt, or La Escalera, or I actually wrote a book about another one, the 1825 one. For the case of Brazil, it's most of the information that we have is about the Malay Revolt of 1835. But in reality, there are many other movements that are not really well studied. And until they are not well studied, we are going to continue to have problems trying to understand them and trying and giving them the right place in history. And the reason I said that is because historians who are not very keen on looking to Africa and African history, they have just jumped into conclusions very rapidly, and they have left the African side of the story out. And a classic case of this, there is a recent book by Johannes Postma, which is a book on slave rebellions in the Atlantic War or something like that. I don't remember the title now. I was not supposed to be talking about this today, but anyway, there you go. This book actually discusses slave rebellions in Cuba and Brazil, and yet it arrives to conclusions such as that these movements were influenced by the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, British abolitionism, but there is not a word about Africa. And the reason this is happening is because Johannes Postma didn't have the right information to draw conclusions, and he's drawing conclusions based on stuff that were proposed by people like Eugene Genovese, for instance. This is something that actually is also behind what I try to do here. So the logical way for me to go about this was to look at the slave rebellions that took place in Bahia and Cuba. They take place there are two cycles of a slave rebellion that they are near simultaneous. I mean, comparing the dates, you will see that they are not that far off. And they are going to be led by kind of the same people. Okay, people coming from the same African regions, people who have a very similar background. I'm going to get into that in a second. Something very interesting here is that Marcela actually asked me this question the other day, is how exactly are they comparable? How a territory that is an island, which is a colony of Spain, is comparable with another territory that is sort of a province and a state of another country. And the way I look at them, actually, I don't even look at the whole of Cuba. I mostly look into the western part of Cuba, which is a plantation area, which is around, I don't have a map of Cuba, I'll show you later, around the cities of Havana and Matanzas in the western part of the island. For the case of Bahia, it's the same. I'm looking at the Reconcavo Valley and the city of Salvador. I'm not going much further than that. So they are very localized places. They are not really the whole of Bahia or the whole of Cuba. So there are areas that they have extensive plantations, there are plantation societies where there is an intensive exploitation of labor, slave labor, and which are, both places are heavily African. And I don't even want to call it Africanized, they are African. So I saw that these two cycles of a slave rebellion, they were very comparable. And the interesting thing actually that I also thought is that people who have come before me, people who have produced excellent studies about stuff like this, and I'm thinking about your race, for instance, but also Jose Luciano Franco in the case of Cuba, or Matt Childs more recently, they never thought about comparing these two cases, and it's kind of a given that they need to be compared. It was clear to me much before I decided to compare them that a comparison was in order and needed to be done. And why? Is because, well, the people who are going to lead these movements, the people who are going to form these African armies are going to come from similar places in Africa. They are going to have similar, in some cases almost identical cultural backgrounds. And another thing that they have in common, all of them, is that they are coming from an area that is engulfed by warfare at the time. We have the Fulani Jihad in the north of these territories. We have the civil wars across the Yoruba-speaking territories. So all this comes together and they become actually prisoners of war. The interesting thing here is that these prisoners of war that eventually become slaves are going to be the leaders of these movements on the other side of the Atlantic. They are going to come up with the ideas, they are going to develop the ideas, and they are going to lead these movements. So to understand these people, I actually had to start figuring out a new methodological way of approaching the topic, because there were many concepts and categories and terms that were not working for me. For instance, the concept of ethnicity, it was starting to fall short of what I needed. What I needed to understand is because ethnicity, as such, was very useful when looking at these people in Africa, but once they were transported across the Atlantic, on the other side of the Atlantic, they were not the same people. Meaning that their identifiers, the denominators, or whatever you want to call it from an ethnic point of view, are going to change. So people who were, for instance, from the Dahomey, they are going to become Arara or Ewefon or whatever, or Jeje, sorry, on the other side of the Atlantic, and that really doesn't do justice to who they were and how they identify themselves. So, how did I solve this problem? There is a concept that has been developed recently by Douglas Chambers, which is the concept of neo-diasporical ethnies. And this kind of solved my problem here, because these neo-diasporical ethnies kind of represent, in my opinion at least, is a concept that has actually encompassed in a better way who these people were. So I'm working with that, and that actually kind of solved my problem as well, because I was able then to start doing what I wanted to do, which was to find correspondences between what was happening in Africa and what was happening in the Americas at the same time. To link the history of these people, to link the history of these places as well, to bring it all together into the same study. The interesting thing here is that with the West African side of the story, I had a big issue with the sources. And not the first one or the last one to have to deal with this. The sources for these West African regions until 1825 are almost non-existent. And after that are still very precarious. And most of the sources that you get are produced by European travelers. So the information that we have is very scattered and it's very problematic, and it needs to be read with a lot of care. This problem is so serious that, and this I haven't seen it anywhere in the Americas so far, it's so serious that actually chronological problems, they have become a subject of a study in themselves, okay? Which is something that you don't see everywhere. It's very, very difficult at this stage of the game in the Western Academy in a way, to have people discussing chronology. This doesn't happen very often anymore. So what I figured out, and this some people, again, some historians like Paul Lovejoy and Joao Reis and John Thornton, they have done this before, is I figured out that the Cuban sources, the Spanish sources, the Portuguese and Brazilian sources that address the history of these people in Brazil and Cuba, were exactly the same opposite. Were exactly the opposite. I mean, they actually are very rich, as I said before, and they gave us insights into the actions of these men and women that could also enlighten not only what they did in the Americas, but also their histories back in Africa. So these diasporical sources are actually also very useful to write West African history. And this is something that this book actually tries to do, is to link both areas. Keeping all this into consideration, I actually had no choice but to submerge in African history. My formation is the formation of a Latin American historian. I knew very little about West African history before I wrote this book. I was already reading from my previous book, but I didn't dive into West African history the way that I had to do with this book. And whereas it was a really difficult task for most of the time, I had this moment that I was reading about the Empire of Oyo, what is today Nigeria, and the things that are happening in this period, it actually remind me of Star Wars at some point. I know the analogy is not very enlightening, but actually there were things that were happening there that remind me a lot of what happens in Star Wars in the Return of the Jedi and all that. It was very complex for me. I actually struggled to understand what was happening there. But the one thing that I came out, when I came out the other way, the end of the tunnel, there were quite a few things that became very clear to me. And one of them was that, and John Thornton has called this the invisibility of Africa. Something that became very clear is that most of military historians who have referred to the history of Africa in this period, and I'm not saying all, but most of them, and certainly almost all of them until the 1980s, whenever they talk about warfare in the war and in a war context or whenever they had to refer to warfare in Africa, at least when it comes to West Africa, they always refer to it as a small warfare. They actually use this term. And basically they look at warfare in West Africa as small skirmishes and small battles, and there is an implicit backwardness in the way in which they thought about Africa. Sadly enough, this is not something that has gone away. Still, there is this kind of thinking of Africa as a backward place. As a matter of fact, it was very different. Okay? The warfare that we have in this area, in this period, is nothing like that. There are well-organized armies with, I'm not going to say state-of-the-art weapons because it won't be true, but with modern weaponry, armies that they are actually organized every year or every 2 years with the aims of capturing slaves, to selling the slave to the transatlantic slave trade or the trans-Saharan slave trade. And the processes of war and enslavement that they produce are actually processes that even today have not been integrated into this Atlantic history. And they're really important if we're going to understand the Atlantic in this period. Because these people are exporting hundreds of thousands or millions, if you want, into the Atlantic. These are men and women who are making the way across the Atlantic. And this is the world they're coming from. Okay? I don't see any other way of putting it more straightforward. This is the world they're coming from. So understanding this world is very important, I think. The interesting part, when it gets even more interesting, is that from the moment the British abolished slave trade in 1807, they actually create, they set in motion they set the process in motion in which by the 1820s, only two places in the Americas are going to continue to import African slaves. These places are Brazil and Cuba. In the case of these West African regions, I would say the vast majority of these men and women are going to end up in two areas of the New World, and these are Cuba and Bahia. They don't go to Rio, they don't go to Maranhão, they go to Bahia. And this, of course, again, is another reason why to compare these two areas. It's remarkable because these are the two areas, not other areas of Brazil, but Bahia and Cuba, they are the two areas where you have these cycles of a slave rebellion taking place in this period. So, why is this relevant? I also think, I don't know if you're aware aware of the work of Orlando Patterson and Stephanie Smallwood and other scholars who have emphasized that they have focused on the slave trade as a process of rupture, where people are degraded, people are dehumanized, and as Orlando Patterson said, going pretty far in my opinion, they can even face social death. I'm trying to position myself, I'm trying to rethink this and try to position myself on the opposite side of the spectrum. And what I'm trying to do in this book is to try to stress the continuities. I'm trying to say that these people, even though they were subject to all kinds of brutalities in the slave trade, still they managed to make it through. Still they managed to have families on the other side of the Atlantic. They managed to find ways of emancipating themselves on the other side of the Atlantic, and they found ways of continuing to do what they knew how to do in Africa, in West Africa in this case, and for the purposes of this book, they continue to carry out warfare. They continue to carry out war on the other side of the Atlantic in the same way they knew how to do from Africa. In this part, I always tend to get a little bit angry because while writing this book, I realized that I had two major obstacles. This was one of them. This idea that these men and women, that historians in the 20th or the 21st century are making calls and actually making assumptions about these people, that they were dehumanized, that these people, they actually faced social death, when in reality, the situation is much more complex than that. This actually bothered me a little bit, to be honest with you. And the other thing that also worried me a little bit is that once these people have made it on the other side of the Atlantic, then they were not able, according to certain historians, they were not able to take arms unless they were under the influence of the French Revolution or the Haitian Revolution or British abolitionism or something else produced in Europe or the Americas. It's what John Thornton, as I said before, called the invisibility of Africa. It's just not there. And it's not there because it's backward. Okay? So it really gets me angry. And this is one of the reasons, driving forces behind this study. I actually tried to dialogue a little bit with Stephanie Smallwood. She actually calls the 18th century slave trade as a mutilated assemblage of people, and she may have a point for the 18th century slave trade, which is a legal slave trade, at least from the European side of point of view. But in the 19th century, when the dynamics of the slave trade change, and the slave trade becomes illegal, and the British patrols, and American patrols, and French patrols start policing the Atlantic, the dynamics change. People, they have to be put into ships within hours. Therefore, the slave traders, they don't get the opportunity to pick and choose anymore. They just put in the ship whoever they can. And this is literally like that. These changes in the modus operandi of the slave trade, of the slave traders, actually lead to changes in the patterns of enslavement. These are not intentional changes, but they take place in the patterns of enslavement in West Africa. So there are new interactions among people who are going to be sent to the Americas. There are new forms of bonding, there are new friendships, there are new interethnic alliances, and no wonder when they made it across Atlantic, these sometimes ethnic differences that seem unsurmountable on Africa are going to be surmounted in the Americas. They are going to come together in spite of everything. They are going to come to these two areas, and one thing that I thought that I had to highlight very much, and the historians don't make enough emphasis on, is that, and again here we come to this binary system of continuity and rupture. It is that the world these people are going to find on the other side of the Atlantic is not that different to the world they knew from Africa. Okay, from the stars in the sky, which are going to be the same stars that are going to be themselves for the crops, for other things, religious reasons, etc. Temperature, humidity, precipitation, atmospheric pressure, the rivers, the plant genera, everything is going to be known to them. If any of you has been a migrant and you happen to migrate from Europe to the tropics or from the tropics to Europe, you will understand what I'm talking about here. When you migrate to a cold country and you're coming from the tropics, you find it very difficult. Okay? And probably it's the same vice versa. Well, actually, this is the same vice versa. But these people are going from one place that where they grew up to another place that is not that different. There's more of continuity than rupture in these places, both in Bahia and Cuba. And this is obviously a result of being in the tropics, but it's also a result of having been part of the same supercontinent, the West Gondwana, until the Jurassic period, when they split up. So the plant genera, animals, stuff like that were very important for them, they are going to be there. And stuff like that could be seen as irrelevant, like for instance, thunderstorms are still there. And this is very important for them so that they can actually worship Shango, for instance. So these things are actually relevant. If they would have gone to England, they would have been able to worship Shango. There are no thunderstorms there. Take it from me. So it is very important to emphasize this, and it's also the social side of the story is very important, because even though many of these people are going to end up in plantations, those who end up in cities, so like Salvador or Havana or Matanzas or Cachoeira, they are going to go to urban centers, but even these are not that different. I mean, the Yoruba, by all accounts, in this period were the most urbanized people in West Africa at the time, and probably in the whole of Africa. These people live in towns and cities. They like to be surrounded by people. They were used to be surrounded by people, not like. So even that is not going to be that dissimilar to what they knew from Africa. So all this effort of bringing together these two areas and to linking them also lead me to one last thing that actually also bothered me a little bit, and here is where I'm going to ditch the concept of a slave rebellion or a slave revolt and move beyond that, and is that there is something that is very clear from the books that we read, and yet it's been happening for 150 years, and yet we don't seem to question it too much, and it's how Western concepts are applied to non-Western societies and non-Western processes. And it is kind of troublesome, because we are trying to understand the actions of African men and women, and obviously we're working with European or American sources most of the time, and we continue to accept the way these people talk about them. We continue to accept the terms, the terminology, the concepts that they use without questioning them. We cannot always change them, but we definitely have to question them. And here is where I ditch the slave rebellion term, because what I saw in the sources, and if you actually read my book, you will get a big dose of this, is that the Africans, when they were interrogated, they chose to use the word war, not rebellion, not insurrection. They consistently use the word war, even when they are being translated. And let me try to illuminate this a little bit. The Yoruba, they have one word for war. It's called Ogun. They have other words for insurrection, rebellion, skirmish. They have specific words for that. Okay? When they were translated, the translator used the word war. So they were using Ogun. The same happened with the Hausa. They have two words for war, Yaqui and Fada. And they have words, other words for all these other actions like rebellion, insurrection, etc. And yet, every time they are translated, they are going to be translated as war. So they are using either Yaqui or Fada. Obviously, it gets even more complicated because we cannot use 20th century Hausa or 20th century Yoruba. So basically what I had to do here was to go to the earliest translations of Yoruba and Hausa, of text into Yoruba and Hausa by Europeans and by Africans, and look at the terms there. I got lucky enough that the first translations, most of them were translations of the Bible, which is full of war actions. So you can actually track down this this terminology in this translation of the New Testament and especially the Old Testament for both of them. So what I'm proposing in this book is to try to understand these events as actions of war instead of rebellions. And I'm not saying to ditch completely the term slave rebellion. I'm just proposing not to use it when we are trying to understand the human side of this story, the human experience of these people, how these people saw themselves. I'm not trying to speak for them, I'm just trying to look at the story from a different angle, which is not the angle that has been always reproduced from the time of the slave owners until now. How did I do that? As I said before, I chose to go for extraordinary events, because extraordinary events produce extraordinary sources. And two or three things were very important, and I decided to follow what African historians have done about warfare in West Africa. So I decided to split my research and my analysis into stuff like organization and strategies, leadership, and then I go, and we will get there in a minute, military operations and tactics, gender, ethnicity, and the composition of the troops, and weapons and the war paraphernalia that these people use. There are things that they were very evident. Actually, something that I didn't mention before when I was being a little bit critical of African sources, what it remains is that even though the Europeans get there in the 1820s and they start writing about these people, there are other sources. There are visual sources, and like these are classic cases from the Abomey palaces in Dahomey, and both of these images I actually chose them because they highlight actions of war of the Dahomey people against the Yoruba. Both of these, I have many more which do not refer to Yoruba, but these two they do, and these are both actions of war against the Yoruba. And the interesting thing here is the weaponry you can see here is really varied. You know, you have arrows and bows, knives, and machete, cutlasses, and even a shotgun. So this actually highlights the fact that these people were already familiar with even more modern weaponry. So what I try to do here is to find this correlation, okay? To try to find stuff that match each other from both sides of Atlantic. When it comes to organization and strategies, it's very obvious that the way these people organize themselves in West Africa, in these West African states, is being reproduced in Cuba and Bahia during these actions of war. So they are going to use kind of the same strategies of recruitment. Their plots are going to be very similar. Their objectives and targets are going to be very clear. They are always going to use their African languages to organize these events. Obviously, they are not going to be speaking in Portuguese or Spanish. And these strategies usually are going to be related as well to who they were. And most of these events that take place on the other side of Atlantic are going to be led by men and women who had barely spent a few weeks or months in the New World. So they were what in Brazil was called Africano Novo, and what in Cuba was called Bozal. They were new here. And then I also thought that leadership was a very important aspect here, because it would in these extraordinary events, the leaders were the most extraordinary parts of the event. So the authorities would focus on the leaders. They would try to find out as much as they could about these people, and usually the information we get about the leaders actually highlight a wider war. So I did focus a lot on the leaders as well, and the military expertise. You have to remember that it is very easy to dismiss slave revolts, slave rebellions, or action of force by saying, these people, they were not organized, they didn't know what they were doing, because usually it's what happened. They just wanted to rebel spontaneously or whatever. But this runs, the problem here runs deeper, and is that these leaders were the leaders that remain after the Middle Passage. Okay, this is a decimated army. This is a decimated people. Even in Africa, some of them may have not been very capable. But across Atlantic, they have to do with what they are left with. So maybe they didn't have generals, maybe they had captains, and I'm using Western terms to refer to them to make things easier. But something that you can find is that usually on occasions, African terms are given to these leaders in the Americas. And there is a classic case in 1833 in which a man who leads men into battle is called Bale. And Bale is a local leader, a local village leader in Yoruba-speaking territories at the time. So you can see this, or there are Hakimis as well, which is a Hausa term for this. These leaders usually also are going, and this we know because the authorities focus on them, almost in a paranoid way. They are going to have specific skills, and they are going to have symbols of leadership. And again, talking about this same movement in 1833, there are some of the leaders of the movement who are going to ride horses into battle, and they are going to carry umbrellas, red umbrellas. The umbrella was a symbol of royalty in most of West Africa at the time. When you have umbrellas, there is something there. Europeans would capture generals, African generals in conflicts in Africa, and they wouldn't say, we captured a general. They would say, we captured an umbrella. It was that important. So this you can see on the other side of the Atlantic as well. And so this correlation also extend to the organization of these movements, which is much more elaborated, much more complicated and complex than what we have been led to believe very often. These were not irrational uprisings. These were not people reacting to the fact that they were slaves. These were soldiers. And notice I'm actually using the word soldier, not the word warrior. These were soldiers that belonged to armies. And even those who were not soldiers, there were people who had a first-hand experience of warfare in Africa, because most of them had been enslaved through warfare. So these are people who are, we have to understand this. Something that is very important here as well is that these people are going to have an experience of raising small armies at a very short notice. And this is important throughout West Africa at the time, beyond the area that I'm looking at here. In the Yoruba-speaking territories, for instance, these bales, these local captains, these local village leaders, they were supposed to assemble armies within 24 hours or 48 hours, gather weapons, make the weapons or gather the weapons and run to help the armies of the Alafin of Oyo or the Onikoyi of Oyo, whoever it was. So these people were supposed to gather armies at a very short notice. But it goes beyond that, because what European and what Western historians, they have always assumed when looking at the slave rebellions in Cuba and Bahia and other parts of the Americas, is that because they started as small movements, they were doomed from the beginning. And the Africans who started this movement, they had to know that the movements were doomed. Well, that doesn't work like that either. It doesn't. And the most classic case of this is the Fulani Jihad that starts in 1804. This movement starts with 20-something people rebelling against the Sarki of Gobi, which was a house state in the area. 20-something people run away, assemble together, go to war with this guy, they get defeated, they run away again, and somehow they gather more people. They have a second battle in which they are almost defeated, but somehow the battle turns again up in his head, and this goes from being another small skirmish in West Africa into the largest movement of the 19th century in the area, which is the Fulani-led jihad, that takes over basically all the Western and Central Sudan in the period. So it's more complicated than saying, no, these people that didn't know what they were doing, they were going to die. They knew they were going to die. No, it goes beyond that. They may have known that they were going to fail, but not necessarily. They knew. They actually probably thought they could succeed. Things that you can see as well are, for instance, the techniques that these people, the tactics that they use in these movements in the Americas, they resemble very much what they do in Africa as well. Like hand-to-hand combat, pitched battles. These things are very common. The way they retreat from battle. I could go on forever on this. The gender and ethnic participation as well. Gender is something that usually is not referred to much when we discuss these things, but in these West African states, including the Muslim states, women of noble birth usually led armies into battle. People don't talk a lot about that, but they did. And in both in Cuba and Brazil, you have cases, in Bahia, you have cases of women leading armies into battle. As a matter of fact, the most important African military action that takes place in Cuba takes place in November 1843, and it is led by 2 women and a man. There is a monument to this movement. It has 3 slaves, 3 Africans, which happen to be 2 men and a woman. So go figure. So the weapons they are going to use also are very, very enlightening. They are going to use weapons that are in disuse in Europe already at the time. So spears, for instance, or shields that they are going to make as the movement move along. And as I said before, the war paraphernalia that goes beyond the umbrellas is also related to amulets, charms, and flags, standards. All these things are going to be carried into battle. And the important bit here is that this is not Western, okay? Because these people had just arrived from Africa, there's very little chance that there was contamination with Amerindian peoples as well. Although there is always a possibility here because they also were very skillful at using bows and arrows, spears, etc., etc. So I don't want to bore you too much more with this. I just want to stress a couple of things. I think that is, as I said before, I'm trying to place this book into this debate of continuity versus rupture, and I do it in a very aware way. I'm very aware of what I'm doing. I think that we cannot continue to look at these movements as simplistic or as a movement without direction or leadership or real aims, because they were not really revolutionary according to what revolutionary means in the age of revolution. After all, the jihad is actually a revolution. The Fulani jihad is a revolution. I think that it's very important that we start incorporating this event into the history of the Atlantic, especially in the age of revolution. If we are going to be fair to its history, that the Atlantic also encompasses Africa, after all, and we need to try to find the place of Africa within this history. We have to stop this historical blindness toward Africa. This invisibility of Africa has to stop. And to do that, we actually need to visit or revisit and reassess the role of Africa, and the role of African men and women, both in Africa and in the Americas. Try to understand this history a little bit better. And I'm done. Thank you very much.
Move on to the Q&A sections, fielding questions from you all. So, who would like to go first?
If I may, thank you so much. That was superb. The second jihad you described as a Fulani-led movement. I always think of it as a house of Fulani, but the houses in your setup were also enslaved, captured by the Fulani, or were they?
Oh yeah, the jihad, as a matter of fact, one of the main reasons behind the jihad is that Usman Dan Fodio, who is the leader of the jihad,
Right.
he tries to justify it by saying that the enslavement of Muslims has to stop. And yet, the jihad actually enslaved probably more Muslims
Right.
from virtually every place than they were being enslaved before. So,
But then,
and houses are there, obviously.
but then in the transatlantic slave trade, the victims, the people who were enslaved, were the non-Muslim Yoruba people of the various Yoruba groups, of the 6 or 8 Yoruba groups, and that made the warrior nucleus of these communities in Cuba and in Brazil.
Yeah. Obviously, the Hausa, they play a very important role in Bahia until 1816. I mean, they are at the heart of every single movement in Bahia until 1816. After 1816, there are things happening in Africa that actually have to do with this.
Right.
This is like the first push of the jihad stops in 1814, 1815, the real push. It's they take Alcalawa, which is the capital of Gorilla, and they settle. And then the expansion starts eastward and southwards. But until 1816, they actually play a very important role. And there is an impasse until 1822, there are no movements recorded. And then the Yoruba take over.
Just a tiny footnote. The abolition of slavery really did start to take effect in the early 1800s here, but right down Narragansett Bay, James DeWolf and his family followed for another 15 years slavery without saying where they were picking up slaves from, but they James DeWolf had 3 plantations in Matanzas.
Yeah, I've been to them.
Yeah. Well,
I took their family when they were doing the documentary. I found them in their car, actually. Funny enough. Long time ago, it was in the 90s. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to thank you so much for your presentation, and very impressed with the amount of research you've done. You found many similarities between the cases of Cuba and Bahia, but did you find any differences between like the success or the failure of the rebellion or the acts of war between Bahia and Cuba? Like, what were the differences that you found?
There are many differences, and consciously I decided to focus on the similarities, because that's the point that I'm trying to make. It's really simple to find many differences, and I think that's what historians have done throughout the years. Although they haven't been comparing, but there is a lot of disruption that is caused by the Middle Passage, and for instance, there is something that is we could be discussing this the whole day, and it's the role of Islam in these 2 places. I mean, Cuba is still receiving, I have an ongoing discussion with Paul Lovio about this. Cuba is still receiving a lot of Muslims, Muslim slaves, and yet Islam doesn't play, as long as we know, this may change tomorrow, it doesn't play any role in any of these movements in Cuba. And yet in Bahia, it is a really cohesive social force. Even though I still think that the ethnic background of these people is much more relevant, but it is a very important social force. So there is a big difference that you can highlight, but there are many more. For starters, in Bahia, the urban environment seems to be a better setting for these movements than in Cuba, which is mostly rural. So there are differences that are pretty obvious.
It seems like you challenge a lot of the traditionally accepted Western narratives of this history. Are there other works out there that do something similar? Or would you say you're kind of one of the first to challenge these narratives?
I think you all race have been challenging this for a long time, and Beatriz Mamigonian as well in Brazil. In Cuba, there hasn't been that much of a challenge. I think that for instance, there has been a discussion, an ongoing discussion that is I thought it was dying, but I'm not sure it's dying anymore, which is this whole discussion about the age of revolution that started with Eugene Genovese, who classified slave rebellions before and after the Haitian Revolution. The character changes, and he's doing that based on what he knows from the United States. And this is something that I have found very troubling throughout my career. I started studying history in the 80s, in the 90s, not in the 80s, not in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 90s. I was born in the 80s. I always found it very troubling because not only with this, but almost with everything. And I don't want to be a bad guess, but American historians, they have tend to extrapolate from American history. We are really making an effort to understand other areas. And I'm not saying all American historians, please, don't take it away, because there are excellent American historians who have really tried very hard to break with this pattern. But it's very common still to find them. There are some of them alive and kicking. And it's very difficult to dialogue sometimes if they are not willing to engage with other historiography seriously. Because, you know, something that I found when I was working on this book was that I actually had to read African history for real. It was not like, you know, I'm going to read 3 or 4 books, you know, I'm going to read Rocky's book and a couple of books and I'm fine, you know, I'm set. I'm going to write now. No, I actually started finding articles, really obscure articles from the 60s and the 70s that you could only find them either in microfilm, or you had to find somebody in Nigeria to go to some obscure library somewhere to find you an article that was not findable anywhere else. So you have to be serious about that. And this kind of seriousness is not always there. So it's kind of a challenge to discuss with this kind of historians when they are not willing to really engage with that. Obviously, the state of affairs has changed in the past few years. I mean, we have a very different dynamic now going on, but this is a situation that still exists. This extrapolation. European historians do it as well, for what it's worth. Yeah.
Did you find any documentation about maybe some of the ceremonies that were done before any of the war efforts? I'm talking about like maybe in Cuba and
there is information about some of them, and some of that information was found by other people, like Howard Prince or Pierre Berger or Joao Reis for the case of Brazil. For the case of Cuba, Jose Luciano Franco found information about that. Aisha Finch is finding information about that now. There is a book coming up pretty soon as well on that, on La Escalera, that actually deals with this. I found information, and obviously this is information that it has to be looked at very carefully, because all this information is always filtered through Spanish or Portuguese Brazilian officers.
So that would be
So
really good to compare if you could find information about any of the ceremonies that were done in Africa,
Yeah.
Before war, and to look at.
There are very specific descriptions actually in some cases about what do they even mean actually. Why would you stack a knife on the ground? Why would you spread beans on the floor, on the ground? Stuff like that is very clear. But obviously, in the book, this show up sometimes. There are moments in which they even refer to it. There is a case, and to me this was one of the reasons I actually wrote this book, is because of this case, and I use it in the conclusions of the book. It's this guy who goes to he's involved in one of his movements, and he goes to he's arrested, and the Spanish prosecutor asked him, so, are you a Christian? The guy said, no, I'm not a Christian. No, so, what is the name of the God of your country? And the guy said, Olorum. The guy said, oh, do you swear by Olorum that you're going to tell the truth? And for me, it was fascinating, because I have seen in other opportunities saying, do you swear by the God of your country that you will tell the truth? But this prosecutor is interested to knowing the name of the God of this guy, and then it makes him into a binding deity in the swearing ceremony. So for me, it was like it's everything's coming together in one moment in time, in one very short moment in time. This guy, this prosecutor, to me, is actually is going farther than many historians did after him. To me, this guy is ahead of his time, by far. Even though he's a prosecutor who is actually executing these people, and sending these people to get it executed. But in that respect, this guy actually acknowledged more than many historians acknowledged later on. So there are descriptions of these ceremonies. There are references to what these people believe before and after as well. Suicides, for instance, is something that I found very enlightening as well. The belief of these people in the reincarnation of the physical reincarnation of the soul, what they used to call the myth of the flying African. It was funny enough, people still use that, which is not the way to call it, but anyway.
We have time for one last question. If not, I would like to say thank you again to Professor Barcia.
Thank you.